The first time people started calling her just a nurse, she didn't mind. She wore the title like a badge, a reminder of why she had joined the field hospitals at the front. She was not there for glory or for medals. She was there for the wounded, the broken, the forgotten soldiers who lay bleeding in the dirt with no one else to hold their hand. Her name was Aisha Rahman, a woman of 31 who had trained in medicine since her early 20s. When the war broke out, she volunteered to be deployed near the front lines, knowing full well that bullets did not discriminate between doctors, soldiers, or nurses. She saw more death in her first month than most people would in a lifetime, but she stayed. She stayed because her presence meant that at least one more man might live to see another day. But the soldiers, hardened and desperate, often dismissed her. "She's just a nurse," they would say when she tried to stop them from rushing back into the fight with half-healed wounds. They respected her work, yes, but never imagined she was anything more than a pair of steady hands with bandages and morphine. That label followed her for months until one afternoon when everything changed. It was late September, the air sharp with the scent of gunpowder and the dampness of early autumn rains. The field hospital had been hastily set up in the ruins of an old schoolhouse, its windows shattered, its chalkboard still streaked with faint white lines from a class interrupted years before. Outside, the low rumbles of artillery shook the earth, but inside Aisha moved like a quiet current, her hands steady as she stitched wounds, applied pressure, whispered comfort to men twice her size. She had grown used to the rhythm of chaos, the sudden rush of stretchers, the guttural cries of pain, the silence of death that fell like a shadow when a life slipped beyond her reach. On that day, though, something felt different. She noticed the way the soldiers entering the ward kept glancing nervously toward the shattered windows, their eyes scanning the hills beyond. She caught fragments of their hushed talk. An enemy sniper had taken position across the valley, pinning down their supply line and striking at anyone foolish enough to show themselves. Several men had already been shot, and the unit was shaken. "He's a ghost," one soldier muttered. "Every time we peek our heads out, he's already waiting." Supplies were running low because no convoy dared cross the road. Fear was growing like mold in the corners of the hospital. Aisha listened, but she said nothing. She knew fear had a way of feeding itself, of turning whispers into monsters. Still, she couldn't ignore the tension that filled the room like smoke. Each time she stepped outside to wash her hands or to dump bloodied bandages, she felt the invisible eyes of the unseen shooter. She didn't speak of it, but her instincts told her the sniper was close, closer than the soldiers guessed. That evening, as the sun bled red into the horizon, one of the young privates she had been tending was struck by a bullet through the shattered window. The shot came so fast, so precise that no one had even seen the flash. The boy died instantly, his lifeless eyes still reflecting the amber light of dusk. A hush fell over the room. The sniper had breached their safety. No one dared to move near the windows now, and the hospital became a cage. For the first time, Aisha felt anger coil inside her chest. She could endure blood and death, she could endure exhaustion and the indifference of command, but she could not endure the thought of her patients being hunted like animals where they should have been safe. That night, long after the soldiers had lain down with their rifles clutched to their chests, she sat alone beside the body of the fallen private and made a quiet decision. Aisha's father had been a hunter. Before medicine, before the war, before she had even thought of becoming a nurse, she had spent years in the forest with him, learning the art of patience, of breathing with the earth, of pulling a trigger only when certainty was absolute. She had set her rifle aside when she entered university, believing she would never again need to aim at a living being. But war has a way of tearing old memories from the soil of the past and planting them anew in blood. That night, she sought out the unit's captain, a man named Karim who had always looked at her as if she were too fragile for the world she chose to serve. She told him she could take the sniper. He stared at her as though she had lost her mind. "You?" he asked. "You're a nurse, not a marksman." But Aisha's eyes did not waver. She reminded him of her hunting days, of her steady hand that never trembled in the operating tent or on the trigger. At first he refused outright. He could not bear the thought of risking the only nurse they had left. Yet as the night wore on, as another supply convoy was turned back by the phantom in the hills, desperation clawed at him. By dawn he relented. He placed an old rifle in her hands, one taken from a fallen soldier, and muttered, "God help us if you're wrong." At sunrise, Aisha stepped outside, her heart pounding against her ribs but her mind as calm as the surface of a still pond. The cold metal of the rifle felt both alien and familiar in her grip. The valley stretched out before her, mist curling in its folds like smoke from a dying fire. She sank into the ruins of a collapsed wall, her body blending with stone and shadow. Hours passed. The world around her slowed into the rhythm she had once known as a girl, waiting in the forest with her father. Breath in, breath out. Listen to the earth. Let it tell you where life stirs. And then, movement. A faint glint on the ridge opposite, no more than a shimmer in the corner of her eye. Most would have dismissed it as light, but she recognized the signature of a scope catching the sun. She narrowed her gaze, her body coiling like a drawn bow. The sniper was there, hidden among the rocks, waiting for another victim. Her pulse slowed. She pressed her cheek to the stock, exhaled, and in that still silence, she became something more than just a nurse. The first shot she fired cracked through the morning air like the sky itself had split apart. The recoil jolted against her shoulder, but her grip held steady, her eyes locked on the ridge where that faint shimmer had betrayed the sniper's position. Silence followed, a silence so heavy it pressed against her chest. For a moment she thought she had missed, that her bullet had flown into the indifferent earth. Then came the sound, a sharp clatter, metal striking stone, followed by the faintest slump of a body collapsing. The men in the hospital, who had been too afraid to even stand near the windows, rushed to the doorway, peering out in disbelief. "What happened?" someone asked. Aisha lowered the rifle, her breath steady, her face unreadable. "The ghost is gone," she said simply, though inside her blood still roared with the storm of what she had done. She had taken a life, not in defense of herself, but in defense of the helpless men lying under her care. For the first time since the war began, the soldiers no longer looked at her as just a nurse. They looked at her with awe, with a kind of reverence that carried the weight of both fear and gratitude. The relief that swept through the unit was like the lifting of a curse. Supply convoys moved again, bringing medicine, food, and ammunition. The men ventured outside the hospital without ducking or running. Yet for Aisha, there was no relief, only a gnawing unease that took root in her heart. She had done what was necessary, yes, but she had crossed a line she once swore she would never cross. Her life had been dedicated to saving lives, stitching torn flesh, fighting death with thread and needle, with gauze and prayer. That morning she had become the hand of death itself, striking before her enemy could. She did not speak of it, but the weight pressed on her like an invisible hand at her throat. At night she sat by the cots, watching her patients breathe, and wondered how many more lives the war would force her to take. The soldiers whispered about her now, not dismissively but with hushed respect. Some called her, the angel with the rifle. Others simply avoided her eyes as though they feared what she might see in their souls. She tried to ignore it, to bury herself in the endless tide of wounds and fevers, but she could not escape the truth. She was no longer unseen, no longer ordinary. News of her act traveled faster than she expected. Within a week, officers from higher command came to see her, drawn by the tale of the nurse who had done what entire squads had failed to do. They questioned her quietly, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and calculation. Was it luck? Was it instinct? Or was she truly skilled, capable of repeating the feat if needed? Aisha answered with calm honesty. She had grown up with a rifle in her hands, trained by a father who believed every daughter should be as capable as any son. She told them she had acted only because the sniper had endangered her patients, not out of ambition or desire for recognition. Still, she could see the gleam in their eyes, the way they measured her words like coin, weighing the potential of what she represented. Before she knew it, they offered her a choice: remain a nurse in the field hospital or join a specialized unit where her skills as a marksman could be put to use. The decision tore at her. She had come here to heal, not to kill. Yet she could not deny the truth that had revealed itself on that ridge. She had the power to change the outcome of battles, to protect not just the men on her cots but entire companies fighting beyond the walls. That night, she walked the perimeter of the camp, the stars stretched out above her like silent witnesses. Her mind replayed the shot over and over, the moment of stillness, the exhale, the sharp crack, the silence afterward. She thought of her father, how proud he would have been of her precision, how disappointed he might have been that she had used it against another human being. The weight of choice pressed heavier than any wound she had ever treated. She knew if she accepted, she would no longer be the same woman she had been. She would be a soldier with all the blood and burden that came with it. If she refused, she would remain the nurse who once killed a sniper, forever haunted by the knowledge that she could do more and chose not to. Neither path offered peace, but in war, peace was a luxury she had long since given up. By dawn, her decision was made. She would join them. Not for glory, not for revenge, but for the same reason she had become a nurse in the first place: to protect lives. If that meant carrying a rifle alongside her bandages, then so be it. She returned to the hospital and told Captain Karim of her choice. His face betrayed both pride and sorrow, as though he knew he was watching her step into a fire that would change her forever. Within days she was transferred to a forward reconnaissance unit. There she was trained quickly in tactics she already half understood, in camouflage, in silent movement across hostile ground. Her instructors were astonished at her natural calm under pressure, her unerring eye, her ability to wait for hours without shifting an inch. "You were wasted as a nurse," one of them muttered, though she bristled at the comment. She was never wasted. Every life she had saved had mattered. And every life she might protect with her rifle now would matter just as much. Her first mission came sooner than expected. A squad had been ambushed along the river crossing, pinned down by 2 enemy sharpshooters entrenched in the ruins of a farmhouse. Several soldiers had already fallen, and the rest were trapped, unable to retreat or advance. Aisha was sent with a small team to flank the position and neutralize the threat. As they crawled through the grass, mud clinging to their uniforms, the sound of bullets snapping overhead, Aisha felt the same calm descend upon her that she had known with her father in the forest. The earth was alive, whispering its secrets, and she listened. When they reached the ridge overlooking the farmhouse, she spotted the faint shadow of movement behind a cracked window. She steadied her breath, remembering the boy who had died in the hospital, the convoys that had been saved, the men who slept easier because she had dared to take a shot. And once again, with hands that had stitched wounds and held dying men, she became the silent force that turned the tide of battle. The bullet left her rifle like a whisper, slicing through the heavy air of battle. A moment later, the window of the farmhouse shattered, and the enemy sharpshooter slumped forward, his weapon tumbling into the dirt below. The squad pinned along the river cheered at the sudden silence, but Aisha did not linger. She had already shifted her focus, scanning the ruins with patient precision. She knew there were 2, and where one fell, the other would be searching for her. Her team stayed low, trusting her eyes more than their own. Minutes passed, the tension strung so tightly it felt as though the earth itself might snap. Then she caught it, the faintest flicker of movement at the edge of a broken wall, a barrel sliding into view. She steadied her breathing, her finger resting lightly against the trigger. When the second shot rang out, it came not from the enemy but from her. Another collapse, another silence. The men by the river broke free from their cage of fear, charging forward and reclaiming the ground that had trapped them. Aisha lowered her rifle and exhaled. The mission was over, but her war was just beginning. When she returned to camp, the soldiers treated her differently. Before, they had looked at her as if she were some strange mixture of healer and avenger, an anomaly they could not quite define. Now they greeted her as one of their own, clapping her on the shoulder, offering her their rations, sharing stories as though she had been with them since the first day of the war. Some called her the nurse sniper, others shortened it to the angel, though Aisha never asked for titles. She carried them silently, like bandages pressed over wounds. At night, though, she lay awake, her mind torn between 2 worlds. By day she carried a rifle, her trigger finger ending the threats that plagued her unit. By night she returned to the wounded, her hands gentle and sure as she stitched flesh and whispered comfort. The duality weighed on her. To kill and then to heal, to destroy and then to mend, it was a balance no soul could hold forever. But she bore it because no one else could. Because if she faltered, more would die. The war raged on, and with each passing week her reputation grew. Command began assigning her to missions that seemed impossible, clearing nests of hidden sharpshooters, protecting convoys across sniper-infested valleys, escorting officers through enemy territory. She became a shadow in the ruins, her presence felt but rarely seen. The enemy began to whisper of her as well, rumors spreading through intercepted messages. They spoke of a ghostly woman who moved like silence itself, who healed by day and killed by night. Some scoffed at the stories, dismissing them as soldiers' myth. But others feared her, and in war, fear was as powerful a weapon as any bullet. Still, she never sought recognition. Each life she ended was measured against the lives she saved, and that was the only balance she cared to count. Yet for all her skill, Aisha remained haunted. In quiet moments, when the guns fell silent and the campfires burned low, she thought of the faces she had seen through her scope. They were not faceless enemies, they were men like the soldiers she tended, with families waiting, with stories that would never be told. She remembered their final moments, the way their bodies slumped, the silence that followed. She told herself she had no choice, that it was either them or her brothers in arms. And yet, she could not stop the ache in her chest, the part of her that still believed she was meant only to heal. War, however, cared little for what people were meant to be. It carved them into whatever shapes survival demanded, and for Aisha, survival demanded she become both savior and executioner. One evening, after a brutal day of fighting that left the camp littered with stretchers, Captain Kareem found her sitting alone on a ridge overlooking the valley. The sunset painted the sky in hues of crimson and gold, a cruel beauty against the backdrop of war. He sat beside her, saying nothing for a long while. Finally he asked, "Does it ever get easier?" She shook her head, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "No. And if it ever does, that's when we've lost more than the war." Kareem nodded, understanding. He told her the men needed her, not just her rifle but her strength, her presence. They looked to her as proof that even in war humanity endured. Aisha listened, but in her heart she wondered how long she could carry both burdens before one consumed the other. Her answer came sooner than she expected. Weeks later, during a dawn raid on an enemy outpost, her unit was ambushed. Gunfire erupted from all sides and chaos swallowed the battlefield. Aisha found herself separated from her team, crouched behind a crumbling wall with only her rifle and her instincts. Through the smoke, she spotted an enemy sniper lining up a shot at Captain Kareem, who was pinned in the open. Without thinking, she steadied her aim and fired. The man dropped instantly, saving Kareem's life. But in the same moment, another bullet tore into her shoulder, spinning her backward into the dirt. Pain seared through her body, hot and blinding. She gritted her teeth, refusing to let the darkness take her. Crawling with one arm, she dragged herself to cover, her vision swimming. Around her, the battle raged, but all she could hear was the pounding of her heart and the hiss of her breath. She had saved Kareem, but now she was the one who needed saving. The medics found her hours later, pale and bloodied, her uniform soaked through. As they carried her back to camp, the soldiers whispered prayers, their eyes wide with fear that the woman who had seemed untouchable might now be lost. Aisha drifted in and out of consciousness, her mind a haze of pain and memory. She thought of the first time she had stepped into the field hospital, of the boy who had died under sniper fire, of the promise she had made to protect her patients. Had she done enough? Had she balanced the scales between life taken and life saved? She did not know. She only knew she had given everything she had. And as the darkness finally claimed her, she wondered if this was the price all angels paid in war, that they burned so others could keep their light. When Aisha woke, the world was a blur of muted sounds and soft shadows. The sharp scent of antiseptic filled her lungs, and for a moment she thought she had returned to the field hospital where her journey had begun. But as her eyes focused, she realized she was in a more secure facility, deeper behind the lines. Her shoulder throbbed with every heartbeat, wrapped tightly in layers of bandages. She tried to move, but the pain was searing, forcing her to sink back into the thin mattress. A young orderly appeared at her side, relief softening his features. "You're alive," he whispered, as if speaking too loudly might break the fragile thread keeping her tethered to the living. Alive. The word rang in her ears like both a blessing and a burden. She had survived the bullet, survived the chaos, survived where many others had not. But the price was written into her flesh, a reminder carved into bone and sinew that she was not invincible. She had bled like anyone else and she would bear the scar forever. Captain Kareem came to see her soon after. He stood at the foot of her bed, his face lined with exhaustion, but his eyes burned with something deeper, gratitude. "You saved me," he said simply. There was no grand speech, no swelling words of heroism, just the truth spoken with the weight of someone who knew how close death had come. Aisha tried to brush it off, murmuring that she had only done what anyone would have. But Kareem shook his head. "Not anyone. You." He told her how the men had carried her back, refusing to leave her behind, how they had fought harder in those hours because they believed she was worth saving. "You've become more than a soldier to them," he said. "You're a symbol." Aisha turned her head away, uneasy with the word. Symbols were things people worshipped or destroyed, not people who bled and doubted and lay awake at night haunted by faces in their scope. Yet she could not deny that something had changed, not just in the men but in herself. She was no longer just a nurse, and she could never return to the woman she once was. Her recovery was slow, measured in painful steps and sleepless nights. Each movement of her arm sent fire racing down her side, and more than once she wondered if she would ever be able to hold a rifle again. The doctors urged her to rest, to allow her body time to heal, but rest was a luxury she could not afford. Every scream from the ward, every stretcher that passed her door, reminded her that the war did not pause simply because she had been wounded. Men still bled, still died, still needed the touch of someone who cared. So even before she could properly lift her arm, Aisha insisted on helping in the hospital. She stitched with her good hand, gave instructions to orderlies, and sat with the dying when no one else had the heart to stay. The soldiers whispered about her strength, calling her unbreakable, though she knew the truth. She was held together not by steel but by duty, by the refusal to surrender to the darkness gnawing at the edges of her soul. Weeks passed, and though her wound never fully ceased aching, she forced herself back into training. The rifle felt heavier now, less an extension of herself and more a reminder of the fragility she carried. Her first attempts were clumsy, her aim unsteady, and frustration clawed at her. She had always prided herself on her calm, her precision, but now doubt shook her hands. One evening, alone on the range, she nearly gave up. But then she remembered the faces, the boy who had died in the hospital, the convoys she had saved, Kareem's life spared because of her bullet. She tightened her jaw, steadied her breath, and forced herself to fire again. The shot cracked and the target fell. Slowly, painfully, she rebuilt herself, one trigger pull at a time. When she returned to active duty, she was different. Not weaker, though her body bore the memory of her wound, but more resolved. She no longer carried illusions of invulnerability or the reckless fire of someone untested. She had faced death, bled, and risen again. The men noticed the change too. They no longer spoke of her as a legend or a myth, but as something more human, someone who had suffered as they had, yet still stood. That made her presence even more powerful. She was no longer an angel of impossible perfection. She was flesh and blood, scarred but unbroken, and in that they found hope. Her next mission tested her resolve. Intelligence reported that a notorious enemy sniper, one whose record of kills stretched into the dozens, had been redeployed to their sector. He was ruthless, patient, and skilled, the kind of predator who turned battlefields into slaughterhouses. The command wanted him eliminated, and they turned to Aisha. She felt the weight of the request press against her chest. To hunt a sniper was to walk into a duel where only one could emerge. But she accepted, not out of pride but because she understood the cost of hesitation. If she refused, men would die. If she succeeded, lives would be spared. It was not a choice at all. It was duty, the same duty that had carried her from the hospital tent to the ridges of the valley. The hunt began at dawn. She moved with her team through the broken landscape, the ruins echoing with distant gunfire. The enemy sniper was cunning, leaving false trails, baiting positions, daring her to reveal herself. Hours turned into days, the duel stretching across shattered villages and barren fields. Each time she thought she had cornered him, he slipped away, his shots ringing out from new angles, felling soldiers she could not reach in time. The weight of each loss pressed heavier on her heart, but she did not relent. She studied him as if he were a puzzle, noting his rhythms, his patience, the way he favored high ground but always shifted after 2 shots. Slowly she pieced together the map of his mind. Slowly she closed the distance between hunter and hunted. On the 4th day, as the sun dipped low and the land was bathed in shadows, she found him. High on a ridge, his scope trained on a squad moving below. She lay in the grass, her body still as stone, her breath measured. This was not like the others. This was a duel of equals, and only precision would decide the outcome. Her heart pounded, but her hands did not tremble. She thought of her father, of the lessons whispered in the forest long ago. She thought of the men who lay in her care, the ones who would never make it home if she failed. She exhaled, squeezed the trigger, and let fate decide. The bullet sang through the fading light, and in the same heartbeat the enemy sniper fired as well. 2 shots echoed across the ridge, 2 hunters locked in a single moment of destiny. Aisha felt the rush of air as the enemy's bullet sliced past her cheek, so close it burned her skin. Then silence. She held her breath, waiting for movement, for the familiar counter of a skilled opponent. But none came. Through her scope, she saw him slump sideways, the rifle slipping from his grasp, his body rolling against the rocks like a discarded shadow. For a long moment she lay still, unable to believe it was over. This man who had haunted her unit, who had claimed so many lives with ruthless precision, was gone. She had outlasted him, outweighted him, outshot him. Relief should have filled her, but instead a hollowness spread through her chest. She had not killed a monster. She had killed a man who was as skilled, as patient, as human as she was. It felt less like victory and more like the closing of a mirror. Her team reached her minutes later, their voices filled with awe as they realized what she had done. Some clapped her on the back, others whispered prayers of thanks. The men below who had been in the sniper's sights raised their rifles in salute, their lives spared by her bullet. Aisha nodded quietly, accepting their gratitude but speaking little. She could not bring herself to celebrate. Every time she closed her eyes she saw the ridge, the silhouette of a man doing exactly what she had been sent to do: protect his side, strike at enemies, survive one more day. She wondered if somewhere, far beyond these ruined fields, someone would grieve him as deeply as she had grieved her fallen patients. That was the truth of war. Every victory was carved from someone else's tragedy. Despite the weight pressing on her, her reputation soared. Command hailed her as indispensable, her name carried through camps like a whispered talisman. She had become more than a nurse, more than a soldier. She was a symbol of resilience, a proof that even in the darkest hours one person could turn the tide. Yet the more they praised her, the more distant she felt from the person she had once been. She remembered the quiet girl who had first picked up a rifle in the forest, the young woman who had chosen medicine because she believed in mending the broken. That woman seemed like a stranger now, someone buried beneath layers of scars and silence. Every day she wondered if she would ever find her way back, or if she was destined to live and die as the angel with a rifle. The weeks that followed blurred into a rhythm of missions and returns. Aisha moved like a shadow across battlefields, her rifle an extension of her will, her hands still tending to the wounded when the fighting slowed. The soldiers relied on her presence, as though her watchful eye alone could shield them from death. But her body bore the toll. The wound in her shoulder ached in the cold, her nights were filled with restless visions, and her spirit grew heavy under the constant duality of healer and killer. She spoke little, but Karim noticed the weight in her silence. One evening, he sat with her beside the campfire, the flames painting lines of gold across his weathered face. "You carry too much alone," he told her. "Let some of it fall to us. We are all in this together." She gave him a small smile, but in her heart she knew some burdens could never be shared. The faces in her scope, the lives she had taken, those were hers alone to bear. Still she pressed forward. When a new offensive began, her unit was ordered to secure a ruined village that had become a stronghold for enemy snipers. It was a mission that demanded patience and precision, and naturally, it fell to Aisha. The village lay in ruins, its streets littered with rubble, its houses hollow shells echoing with silence. Every window was a potential death trap, every shadow a possible enemy. Aisha led her team cautiously, her senses tuned to the rhythm of the hunt. Hours passed as they advanced street by street, the tension growing with every step. And then it came, a shot from a hidden nest that struck one of her men, dropping him instantly. Gunfire erupted, ricocheting through the hollow streets. Aisha dropped to her stomach, scanning the rooftops, her breath calm despite the chaos. There, the faint outline of a scope behind broken tiles. She steadied her rifle, fired, and silence claimed the rooftop. But the fight was not over. The village was alive with threats, enemies darting from ruin to ruin, each shot another test of her resolve. Aisha moved through it all like water, flowing from cover to cover, her rifle speaking with deadly precision. Each life she ended opened a path for her men to advance, each kill a step closer to securing the ground. By nightfall, the village was theirs, though the cost had been steep. Bodies lay in the streets, both friend and foe, and the stench of smoke and blood hung heavy in the air. Aisha stood in the center of it all, her chest heaving, her hands trembling for the first time in years. She had won, yes, but the victory felt hollow. The dead did not care for who held the ground. As darkness settled, she sat alone on the steps of a ruined church, the sky above fractured by the glow of distant fires. Her rifle lay across her lap, its weight heavier than ever. She thought of the men who had fallen, of the lives she had taken, of the boy she had once been unable to save in the hospital. The line between healer and killer had blurred so completely she could no longer tell which side of it she stood on. She pressed her hand to her wounded shoulder, feeling the throb beneath the bandages, and whispered a silent prayer, not for victory, not for recognition, but for the strength to endure one more day. Because in war, that was all anyone could truly hope for. The night in the ruined village stretched long and heavy, filled with the muted groans of the wounded and the restless shifting of soldiers who could not sleep. Aisha sat awake, her back pressed against the cold stone wall of the church, her rifle resting beside her. She had tended to as many of the injured as she could, her hands moving with practiced care, though exhaustion gnawed at her bones. Each face she treated carried a different weight, gratitude, fear, despair, but all looked to her as though she were something more than human. That belief frightened her. She was not unbreakable, not untouchable. She was flesh, blood, and scars. Yet she allowed them to believe because she knew sometimes faith was as vital as medicine. Soldiers fought harder when they believed an angel walked among them. If that illusion kept them alive, then she would carry it, no matter how heavy it became. By dawn, reinforcements arrived, and her unit was relieved from the village. The men walked with hollow eyes, their victory overshadowed by the toll it had taken. Aisha marched with them, her movements stiff, her shoulder aching with every step. The convoy back to camp was silent, save for the rumble of wheels and the occasional cough of an engine. She sat between two young privates, both no older than 19, their faces pale beneath layers of grime. One clutched his rifle as if it were the only thing keeping him tethered to the earth. The other glanced at her often, his eyes wide, as though sitting beside her meant he might somehow be spared from death. She offered them both a tired smile, though it felt fragile on her lips. She wanted to tell them she was no different from them, that fear clawed at her heart as much as it did theirs. But she said nothing. In war, silence was sometimes the only kindness left. Back at camp, Aisha was summoned by higher command. The tent they led her to smelled of maps and tobacco, the air thick with tension. Senior officers gathered around a table, their eyes sharp, their voices clipped. They praised her for the capture of the village, for her skill that had turned battles and saved lives. But praise was never free. They told her they wanted to expand her role, to use her not just as a sniper but as a symbol for propaganda. Her story would be told across the front lines, her face painted as the angel who healed and struck down enemies in equal measure. Posters, broadcasts, speeches, all to inspire troops and weaken the enemy's resolve. Aisha listened in silence, her stomach tightening. She had not asked to be a symbol. She had not fought to become a face on a poster. She fought because every day men bled in her arms and someone had to protect them. Yet she could see the decision had already been made. War did not care what she wanted. It would carve her into whatever shape it needed. When she left the tent, the weight of their words clung to her like chains. Karim found her sitting alone near the edge of camp, her expression unreadable. He asked her what had been said, and when she told him, his jaw tightened. "They will use you," he said quietly. "They'll build you into something larger than life. But remember, you are still you. Don't let them take that away." She nodded, though she wondered if it was already too late. Every bullet she had fired, every mission she had led, had chipped away at the nurse she once was. Now the world wanted to shape her into a legend. Legends did not bleed. Legends did not doubt. But she did, and she feared the day when the weight of that falsehood would crush her. Her next missions blurred into one another. Each time she was sent to the front, she carried both her rifle and the knowledge that unseen eyes watched her, waiting to weave her actions into stories. She killed efficiently, precisely, never wasting a shot, but each pull of the trigger left her colder inside. She still healed where she could, still pressed her hands against torn flesh, but even those moments felt different now. Patients looked at her not as a nurse but as the angel with the rifle. They whispered her name like a prayer. It should have strengthened her. Instead, it made her feel further from herself, like a shadow stretched thin across a battlefield she no longer recognized. One evening, after a particularly brutal engagement where she had saved a platoon by eliminating 3 enemy marksmen in quick succession, she returned to the hospital tent to find a boy no older than 15 lying on a cot. His uniform hung loose on his frail body, his face pale with fever. He had been pulled from the front lines after collapsing from exhaustion. As she sat beside him, he whispered hoarsely, "Are you really the angel? The one who saves everyone?" His eyes shone with desperate belief, as though his survival depended on her answer. Aisha felt a lump rise in her throat. She wanted to tell him no, that she was only human, that she could not save everyone, that sometimes all she could do was watch as life slipped away. But when she saw the fear in his eyes, she forced herself to nod. "Rest," she told him softly. "You'll be safe now." He smiled weakly and closed his eyes. She sat there long after he had fallen asleep, the lie burning inside her. As weeks turned to months, her legend spread further, beyond the front lines, even into the whispers of the enemy. Some called her a spirit, others a curse, but all agreed she was unstoppable. Yet inside, Aisha felt herself unraveling. Every life she took, every lie she told to keep hope alive, carved deeper wounds in her soul than any bullet ever could. At night, she dreamed of faces, those she had healed, those she had killed, those she had lied to. She woke with her hands trembling, her heart pounding, the weight of her choices crushing her. But still, when the dawn came, she picked up her rifle and her bandages, because there was no other choice. One day, while preparing for another mission, Karim approached her with a rare softness in his eyes. "You've given more than anyone should," he said. "When this war ends, you must find a way to live again. Promise me that." Aisha looked at him, her face shadowed by fatigue, and for a moment she allowed herself to imagine it. A life beyond the smoke and blood, a life where she was only a nurse, where the rifle was nothing but a memory. It felt distant, almost impossible. But she nodded, because in that fragile hope lay the only reason she could keep moving forward. Winter came early that year, draping the battlefield in a cold silence that muffled even the roar of artillery. Snow lay heavy on the ruined buildings, covering the scars of war in a deceptive purity. Aisha moved through the frost like a shadow, her breath turning to mist in the freezing air, her rifle pressed close to her body for warmth. The war had slowed but not ceased. Snipers on both sides turned the frozen landscape into a chessboard where each move meant life or death. For Aisha, the cold was both enemy and ally. It numbed her wound, dulled the pain in her shoulder, but it also froze her fingers, testing the steadiness she relied upon. She adapted, as she always had, but the weight of survival grew heavier with every passing day. Her legend had reached its peak now. Soldiers whispered her name as though she were more myth than woman. Even the enemy broadcast warnings of her presence, cautioning their troops never to linger in the open for fear of the nurse with the deadly hands. Aisha felt no pride in it, only the gnawing fear that she had become something she could never return from. Her missions during the winter were the most grueling she had ever faced. White camouflage cloaks wrapped around her, she crawled through snowdrifts for hours, waiting, watching, breathing as slowly as the earth beneath her. Her targets were often hidden deep within enemy lines, men who had claimed the lives of countless soldiers. Each kill she made saved others, she reminded herself, though the justifications no longer soothed her. She returned from each mission with her face pale, her lips chapped and trembling, her body drained not just by the cold but by the invisible weight of lives ended. The men she saved never saw the price etched into her eyes. They only saw the angel who never missed, who always returned. One night, after a successful mission that had broken an enemy blockade, Karim found her sitting alone by a fire, staring into the flames. He lowered himself beside her, silence stretching between them before he finally spoke. "You're fading, Aisha," he said quietly. She didn't deny it. She felt it too, the way each day stripped away another piece of her, leaving only a hollow shell that moved out of habit. "I can't stop," she whispered. "If I stop, more will die." Karim studied her face, the shadows under her eyes, the tight line of her jaw. "You've done enough to be remembered forever," he said. "You don't have to keep proving yourself." She turned to him then, her gaze sharp despite her exhaustion. "This was never about being remembered. It was about saving lives. That's all it's ever been." Karim had no answer. He only placed a hand gently on her uninjured shoulder, a silent reminder that she was not as alone as she felt. But war rarely allowed for moments of reflection. Days later, word came of a massive offensive planned at the front. Enemy forces had entrenched themselves in a fortified town, their snipers turning every street into a gauntlet. Aisha's unit was chosen to spearhead the assault, her reputation making her indispensable. The soldiers cheered at the news that she would lead them, their faith in her absolute. She felt no triumph, only the familiar tightening of her chest. She had led men into battles before, but each time she feared she was guiding them not to victory but to their graves. Still she accepted the mission. To refuse would be to let others take her place, and she could not bear the thought of sending men to die in a trap she might have dismantled herself. The night before the assault, she walked through the camp, watching the men prepare. Some cleaned their rifles with meticulous care, others prayed softly, their voices carrying in the cold air. A few laughed and joked, masking their fear with bravado. When they saw her, they straightened, their eyes shining with trust. She offered them small nods, words of encouragement where she could, though inside she wondered if she was worthy of the faith they placed in her. Later, as the camp grew quiet, she sat alone and thought of her father. She remembered the hunts in the forest, the lessons of patience, the way he had always said that every shot carried weight. She wondered what he would think of her now, his daughter who carried the skill he had taught her not just for survival but for war. Would he be proud? Or would he grieve the way her path had twisted from healing to killing? The questions haunted her as she finally lay down to rest, though sleep never truly came. The assault began at dawn. Snow crunched under boots as her unit advanced toward the fortified town, the air thick with smoke from artillery shells that had pounded the defenses through the night. The first shots came quickly, enemy snipers hidden in the ruins, their fire precise and deadly. Men dropped in the snow, cries muffled by the roar of gunfire. Aisha moved swiftly, her rifle lifting, her eyes scanning for the glint of a scope, the shift of a shadow. Each time she spotted one, her shot rang out, clearing a path for her men. But the enemy was prepared. For every sniper she silenced, another seemed to rise, their positions staggered, their fire relentless. The town became a labyrinth of death, each corner another trap. Hours dragged on, the fighting brutal and unyielding. Aisha's shoulder burned with pain, but she pressed through, her focus unbroken. Her men followed her lead, their morale unshaken despite the losses. Slowly, painfully they pushed deeper into the town, street by street, house by house. By nightfall they had secured the outskirts, but the heart of the town remained under enemy control. The ground was littered with the fallen, snow-stained crimson, bodies lying where they had dropped. Aisha walked among them, her heart heavy. She had killed more men that day than she had in weeks, but still it was not enough. Too many of her own lay silent, their eyes staring at the sky. As darkness fell, the survivors huddled in what remained of a schoolhouse, their breath fogging in the icy air. Aisha sat in the corner, her rifle across her lap, her body trembling with exhaustion. Karim approached, his face drawn with worry. "We'll attack again at dawn," he told her. She nodded, though every fiber of her being screamed for rest. "Get some sleep," he urged. But Aisha knew she wouldn't. She never did, not before battles like this. Instead, she closed her eyes and listened to the silence, waiting for morning, waiting for the next fight that would demand more than she had left to give. Dawn broke cold and gray, the sky heavy with clouds that promised more snow. Aisha rose before the others, her body stiff, her shoulder throbbing with the dull ache of an old wound. She checked her rifle, cleaned the chamber, and whispered a prayer under her breath, not for victory but for strength. Around her, the men stirred awake, their faces pale and hollow, yet their eyes fixed on her with a quiet determination. She had become their anchor, the figure they clung to when everything else felt lost. She wanted to tell them she was no angel, no savior, just a nurse with scars and trembling hands. But she swallowed the words. They needed faith more than truth, and so she bore the mask a little longer. The assault began again, the soldiers moving cautiously through the shattered streets of the fortified town. The air was thick with smoke and frost, the silence broken by sudden cracks of rifle fire. Aisha led from the front, her eyes scanning every rooftop, every broken window. Twice she spotted enemy sharpshooters before they could fire, her shots saving men who otherwise would have fallen. Each trigger pull felt heavier than the last, yet she carried on, her focus sharp, her breath steady. The battle was not just for ground, it was for survival, for the chance to end the grip of fear that had strangled them for too long. As the fighting dragged into the afternoon, her unit reached the central square, where the enemy had entrenched themselves in the ruins of a government building. It was a fortress of stone and fire, its windows bristling with rifles, its walls scarred but unbroken. The enemy fought with desperate ferocity, their snipers coordinated, their fire cutting down men with brutal precision. Aisha crawled into position behind a broken statue, her scope sweeping the windows. She could feel it in her bones. This was the final stand, the place where the battle would be decided. Around her, the men waited for her signal, their trust absolute. She steadied her breath, sighted in and fired. Her first shot shattered a window, her second dropped a figure who had been lining up on one of her men. Gunfire erupted in answer, bullets sparking against the stone around her. She rolled to new cover, snow spraying with each movement, her shoulders screaming in protest. But she did not stop. Shot after shot, she picked off the defenders, opening narrow windows of advance for her men. Karim led the charge, his voice carrying above the chaos, urging the soldiers forward. Together they surged across the square, forcing their way into the building. The fighting inside was close and brutal, room to room, stair by stair, rifles and bayonets and desperate hands clashing in the dim light. Aisha followed, her rifle less useful in the narrow halls, but her presence unshakable. She bandaged wounds when she could, pulled men back to cover, then lifted her weapon again when the enemy pressed too close. By evening the building was theirs. The last shots faded into silence, replaced by the ragged breathing of survivors. The square outside was littered with bodies, the snow stained red. Aisha stood in the broken doorway, her chest heaving, her hands trembling as she lowered her rifle. They had won, but victory felt hollow. Too many had been lost, and the faces of the dead weighed heavier than the cheers of the living. Karim joined her, his uniform torn, blood streaking his cheek. "It's over," he said, his voice raw. She looked at him, then at the ruins around them. "No," she whispered. "It's never over." For her the war would never truly end. Not while the memories lived in her mind, not while the scars burned in her flesh. In the days that followed, word of the victory spread across the front. The town's capture was hailed as a turning point, and Aisha's name was once again spoken with reverence. Soldiers toasted her around campfires, officers cited her in reports, and whispers of her legend carried even to the enemy lines. But Aisha felt none of the triumph. She spent her time in the makeshift hospital, tending to the wounded with the same quiet dedication she had shown from the very beginning. The men still called her the angel, still looked at her with awe, but she no longer tried to correct them. If the myth of her strength gave them hope, then she would bear it no matter how much it cost her soul. One evening, Karim found her sitting alone in the ruins, staring at the horizon where the sun dipped low behind the snow-covered hills. He sat beside her in silence, then asked softly, "When this ends, what will you do?" She thought for a long moment, her fingers tracing the worn wood of her rifle. "I don't know," she admitted. "I was a nurse before the war. Maybe I can be one again. Maybe I can still heal." Karim studied her face, the shadows in her eyes, the quiet strength in her posture. "You already have," he said. "More than you'll ever realize." She didn't answer. She only looked at the fading light and wondered if she would ever truly be able to leave the battlefield behind. The war would continue, and Aisha would continue with it, her name carried like a prayer, her figure etched into the memories of every soldier who fought beside her. But when they spoke of her, they would not remember the doubt, the exhaustion, the sleepless nights filled with ghosts. They would remember the woman who stood between them and death, who healed with one hand and defended with the other, who was called just a nurse, until the day she lifted a rifle and changed everything. And though she bore the weight of every life taken, every wound tended, she carried it with quiet dignity. Because in the end she had never fought for glory or legend. She had fought for life. And that, more than anything, was what made her extraordinary. The end.